Hello, I am Dr. Randy Robertson, a diagnostic radiologist who has been involved with the medical evidence for almost 25 years. The question before us is, where did the Harper Fragment originate? I hate to admit it, but when I first started out, a popular theory was that there had been alteration of the president's wounds, and that the autopsy photos and x-rays had been forged or altered, and that the Zapruder film had likewise been altered. Much of this was based on eyewitness testimony. I bought it hook, line, and sinker, but then I started to look at the primary evidence. I found that there was needless confusion being introduced by eyewitness testimony. On the question of where the Harper Fragment originated, we don't need eyewitness testimony, whether it be from Kemp Clark, the chief of neurosurgery at Parkland, or any of the doctors or nurses there. We don't need the opinions of Drs. Cairns or Harper, pathologists in Dallas, who didn't have the postmortem skull x-rays at their disposal or the Zapruder film. We don't even need the testimony of doctors, FBI agents, or Secret Service men present at the autopsy. None of their recollections or opinions matter because we have x-rays of the head which record in detail the amount of bone that was missing. No human being has x-ray vision. We also have films of the assassination which show where and when all the major fragments were recovered and arose from. We have x-rays of the majority of the fragments, and specifically we have detailed photos and x-rays of the Harper Fragment. Here are the AP and lateral views of the skull taken post-mortem at the autopsy room. These show in detail the amount of bone which is missing and the fracture pattern in the skull. Half a dozen board-certified radiologists have reviewed the x-rays, and none have noted any significant amount of occipital bone missing. Here is an illustration of that by Dr. David O. Davis, a diagnostic radiologist at George Washington University in D.C. and past president of the American Society of Neuroradiologists, who, working for the HSCA, helped in the making of this illustration. I don't agree with details in the drawing. Notably, it omits a fracture of the lower right occipital bone created by the entry of a bullet documented by the original autopsy team. It has a bullet striking the top rear of the head from behind when it came from the front, and the distribution of the skull fragments is in error, as we shall see from the Zapruder film and the CBS News iTech study thereof. But I and other radiologists are in agreement about the margins of the large defect at the top of JFK's head. In fact, Dr. Boswell diagrammed a piece of the right occipital bone the night of the autopsy. Here in his notes, he has a 6 by 4 by 3 centimeter fragment in the right occipital bone. He held this fragment in his hand the night of the autopsy and measured it and noted its origin, orientation, and dimensions. This is verified by the x-rays. We can see this fragment on the AP skull x-ray. It has the same position, orientation, and dimensions. We can see the top of the 6 by 4 by 3 centimeter fragment here in this autopsy photo. This photo was taken from the front of the head directed to the back. Here you can see the scalp reflected off the frontal bone with a semicircular defect from where the first bullet exited the front of the head. Here is his right cheek, and here is his right earlobe. This is not a picture taken from the back of the head.
Now, I didn't narrate this, but this is my view of the F8 photo. And I will show you on the next slide that there's someone that put facial features on it. But in my mind, this is the left side of the skull. We're looking at JFK's head from above and somewhat downward. That is a ruler that's blanking there, but there's a large expanse of scalp. This is the fragment of bone that we see, the flapping out on the right on the Zapruder film. And on this view, I don't see the 6 by 4 by 3. I see a fracture line here, but I don't see the other fracture line here. And the semicircular defect would roughly correspond to where the spot where the HSCA said a bullet entered.
This is the F8 photo with the facial features added. This is a vertical fracture which extends through the right eye socket, which causes slight lateral deviation of the eye on some of the autopsy photos.
And this would be the semicircular wound of exit for the first bullet which struck JFK from behind.
Now let's look at the Harper fragment. Here is a photo of the interior and exterior surfaces. We see grooves in the bone formed by the pulsating branches of the right middle meningeal artery, which are known to be in the right mid-parietal bone. We see small holes in the bone, which are parietal foramina, which have a very specific location near the midline of the skull. We also see a jagged portion of bone here at the top, which is thought to be part of the sagittal suture, and the x-rays show that the bone loss extended to the left of midline in the same area. All of these characteristics point to this as having originated from the mid-parietal bone. Here's an illustration showing the parietal foramina near the midline adjacent to the sagittal suture, as well as the extent of the parietal bone on the right side of the skull.
Yeah, I should mention that the semicircular defect you saw was just anterior to the coronal suture, and in my estimation, the loss of bone extended back almost to the occipital bone. It may include a small amount, but I don't believe there's a significant amount of occipital bone missing.
Here are the x-rays of the Harper fragment, which show no lead. It should appear black, just like the lead Q46 marker here. The FBI report said that no lead was detectable. If scans taken 40 years after these x-rays were taken show something apparently there, it has to be an artifact, not real. But the real proof resides in the Zapruder film. CBS News contracted the iTech Corporation to do a study of the particulate matter ejected from JFK's head. iTech had developed spy satellites and done photo reconnaissance for the CIA. Now, their study is not perfect because they failed to realize that 5 fragments of the skull were recovered, and they only identified 4 because they didn't look at later frames. They identified 4 fragments arising from the front of the head after the first bullet's impact. One was the Harper fragment, and the other was the Weitzman fragment. Unfortunately, the Weitzman fragment was not x-rayed or photographed as the Harper fragment was, but we do know that it was recovered near the south curb of Elm Street minutes after the assassination. They also identified 2 smaller fragments directed down into the limo, and these were later found in the rear seat and forwarded to the autopsy room where they were x-rayed.
And I might point out that there's the flare of the windshield from the shot coming from behind, distorting it, cracking it, and causing that reflected flare of sunlight. And this is the particulate matter, the 2 major fragments which iTech identified going out into Dealey Plaza. Here we have the ejection and landing of the Harper fragment.
Here's the Zapruder film showing the Harper fragment arising from the mid-parietal bone as the anatomic characteristics previously noted said it should be from. As it spins through the air, the shiny interior surface successively reflects light, whereas the duller external surface does not. It lands in the grass approximately 25 feet south of Elm Street, where it was recovered the following day by Billy Harper. For those of you who think there was some alteration in the Zapruder film, you may wish to review Doug Horn's interview with Brugioni, who said that he saw a piece of JFK's head flying up into the air on the film he was presented with the day after the assassination.
This will see the Weitzman fragment. It's harder to see, but you can see it landing there. There was nothing there before, and you can see it landing right near the curb.
Here is a film of the Weitzman fragment arising from in front of the Harper fragment and landing near the South Elm Street curb where it was found minutes after the assassination. Here is a panoramic still photo of the Zapruder film showing the landing site of the Harper fragment approximately 25 feet south of the assassination site, where Billy Harper originally told the FBI that he recovered it early the following evening, and also the landing site of the Weitzman fragment near the curb, where it was documented as being recovered just minutes after the assassination. The 5th fragment, which went unaccounted for in the iTech study, is the Delta fragment, which was the largest fragment recovered from the assassination. It was seen by eyewitnesses and described in detail by Jacqueline Kennedy, who recovered it from the trunk of the limo. It was found in the rear of the limo and forwarded to the autopsy room with the two smaller fragments from the front identified on the ITEC study. Here in this corner, external beveling was noted and multiple small metallic particles are seen in the same corner. This has led the autopsy team and all subsequent reviewers to conclude that this bears a portion of an exit wound.
Now we'll see the delta fragment. Basically, an X-ray is like a black and white photo. Clint Hill actually loses his step when he pushes it forwards, and he has to remount the back of the back bumper as a consequence.
Here on the later frames not analyzed in the ITEC study, we can see the delta fragment being ejected from the top rear of the head onto the trunk of the limo, and we can see Jackie retrieving it with some assistance from Clint Hill. On this still frame of the Zapruder film, you can see Jacqueline Kennedy's gloved right hand just before she reaches for the delta fragment, which is circled in red.
And we'll see the delta fragment on both the Nix and Zapruder films sliding back and forth. I can't take credit for this. This was Tink Thompson noted this back in 1967 in his book, 6 Seconds in Dallas.
Here is the delta fragment seen both on the Zapruder and Nix films.
Just back and forth. Of course, Zapruder gives us a much better look.
In its correct orientation, the metallic particles in the one corner match up with the 6.5 millimeter lead fragment seen on the autopsy x-rays. This corner of the delta fragment has a nearly 90-degree angle, and the fractures at the top rear of the head form a 90-degree angle as well. It should be noted that the anterior margin of the delta fragment is convex.
This is the anterior margin, this is the corner, and this would have come up over. You cannot see curvature on this two-dimensional photograph.
Could you outline on
The anterior margin of the delta fragment is
Let me see. Now, what did you want to see?
Sorry, I think that's an important point, though. Could you outline on the X-ray where you would place that?
Yeah, I would place it,
in its correct orientation.
Right
The metallic particles in the one corner
you really need to
match
see it on
up with
both.
the 6.5 millimeter
But,
lead fragment seen.
You really need to see it on both, but, you know, we've got metal here, we've got metal here. This edge is coming up like this towards the sagittal suture. This edge is coming around in the parietal bone this way. If I were looking at you, it would come this way. And then that longest side here would connect from here up to the midline. And so,
Put it on the X-ray, though. Just look
right
up.
about here, because here it's missing over the midline, comes down here, and then it goes across like that. You can see the, I don't know if I've got a lateral x-ray on this, in this study or not, but we will,
What is circled in red on the
that is there's a 6.5 millimeter fragment that some have said is embedded in the outer table of the skull, but
There's another fragment that you can identify with
no, what you do is you have to say, a bullet hit the rear of the skull, causing all these fractures.
that. I see.
That bullet, which impacted here, impacted the same corner because it also has multiple metallic fragments.
That's accepting the SDHA conclusion that the upper shot was towards the top of the skull.
Well, they thought that was an entry wound, yes, but actually it was an exit wound.
And then when AARC interviewed 3 doctors who said they never saw that fragment. I'm just saying that people can question that, if that's even legit.
Oh, it's there. You can see it on the lateral view. The question is, for me, whether it's in the external table or, well, it's not a question for me, but it's in.
O from the Zapruder film arose immediately in front of the delta fragment as a concave posterior border, so they fit hand in glove. Additionally, the delta fragment includes a portion of the sagittal suture in the same area where x-rays show bone missing to the left of midline. The pattern is clear. 4 fragments arose from the front of the head, including the Harper and Weitzman fragments were ejected into Dealey Plaza, leaving the top rear of the head undamaged. And a second shot from the front drove the head backwards, ejecting the delta fragment, containing a portion of an exit wound onto the trunk. These 5 fragments comprise the areas of missing skull at the right side of JFK's head, as seen on the autopsy photos and x-rays. We do not see any other fragments ejected from the rear of the head. The Harper fragment is not occipital bone, but mid-parietal bone, as the anatomic landmarks on the detailed photos indicated, and the Zapruder film directly shows. And once again, the x-rays show no occipital bone missing. Now for the autopsy photos. If I was looking at JFK's head, I would say that bone was missing in the back of the head, just as many eyewitnesses said. Eyewitnesses said also that there was a large flap of scalp, which we see here.
It's important to note that the back of his head stops right about here, okay? Because if you look at the lateral view, you can see this metal thing holding his head up, which is resting on. So there's a large expanse of scalp, which is hanging freely from the back of his head. And that's another important point about the Zapruder film, is after the initial explosive wound in the front of the head, if there were actually fractures there, like the HSCA said, from a bullet coming in from behind, up high, all of the fractures would have been created instantaneously, and all of the skull fragments would have been subject to the tremendous pressure which blew out the front of the head. But once the front of the head is blown out, the pressure is released, and the fact that we have no elevation of the scalp or no immediate ejection of bone from the back of the head tells me that that bone and the scalp was not damaged after the initial wound from behind.
This large avulsed area of scalp overlaid the delta fragment, and when this portion of the underlying skull was removed in toto, the large expanse of scalp was left in position to hang down as we see it here. When recovered, there was no scalp attached to the delta fragment. If you mentally take the scalp and pull it back into its anatomic position, you will see that it covers the back of the head. The defect was in the bone, not the scalp. You can see one of the autopsy doctors doing exactly this in this photo.
Yes, if mentally the back of the skull is right about there, you grab this, you pull it up, you cover the hole. The defect was really a bony defect and not one in the scalp. I believe the autopsy doctor said that there was only about a $half size area of scalp that was actually missing.
There was no blowout of scalp from the back of the head, as some eyewitnesses have contested. The Zapruder, Nix, and much more films show this gross distortion of scalp, not loss of scalp, at the rear of the head during the assassination. There was no need to alter the films to cover up a blowout in the back because it wasn't there, as all the films show and the autopsy photos demonstrate. The eye-tech study of the Zapruder film and the documentary record shows that 4 skull fragments arose from the front of the head. 2 of these can be shown to be intimately related: the Harper fragment and the second largest fragment recovered from the limousine. These 2 fragments share fracture lines of approximately 50 degrees each. When put into place, they also share this common vertical fracture located at the same site. In addition, the convex posterior border of the limo fragment number 2 shares the complementary curvature of the concave anterior border of the Harper fragment. Limousine fragment number 2 arose immediately in front of the Harper fragment, as the eye-tech study shows.
Now, you have to imagine how many bone fragments are we going to find in JFK's skull that both have the same angle of the fracture lines converging or diverging, however you want to say it, at the same angle. Plus, you see this curved portion right here fits exactly with this curved portion right here. And when you push that down in place, this portion right here, that vertical fracture line, it's incomplete on the Harper fragment, but it lines up exactly down here with where that would be. And I believe it's not a hard mental exercise to just take that angle, put it in the other angle, and you'll see that and this is from the interior surface of the head. Harper here, and the limousine fragment number 2 just anterior to it, which is exactly what the ITEC study demonstrated.
Here is a graphic placement of the recovered bone fragments into their original positions without any occipital bone being missing.
We know from the film, Harper goes out, Weitzman goes out. I do not know the exact dimensions of the Weitzman fragment. All I can say is that it rose from in front of the Harper fragment, and it was significant in size. The smaller fragment, as I mentioned, it's a 50-degree angle. And on that avulse fragment that comes off of JFK's head to the right at the time of 314, there was an incomplete fracture right through here. And some of the autopsy photos, this actually acted as a hinge, and from one photo to the other, this part opened up and hinged off, not completely falling off, but hinged and moved while they were taking the pictures. And this is basically what I think is we're seeing, as ITEC said.
Here on the Zapruder film, we can see the ejection and landing of the Harper fragment from the mid-parietal bone, recovered at a spot consistent with that described by Billy Harper, with anatomic details locating it to the mid-parietal bone. You may have noted during my presentation that I cite the primary evidence, photos, x-rays, and film, to arrive at my conclusions. I always gauge the veracity or accuracy of eyewitnesses or the opinions of experts on this primary evidence. The primary evidence is incredibly detailed and coherent. What I do not use is unreliable eyewitness testimony or errant opinions of experts to call into question the authenticity of the primary materials. A reliance on inherently unreliable eyewitness testimony and the citation of conflicting expert testimony does not balance the knowledge in the case and only perpetuates confusion where none should exist.
And that's the one thing I want to, and that's the end of the presentation here as far as the slides go, but it's a very complicated area, the medical evidence. And oftentimes, experts are wrong. If the experts were all right, we would have the wrong answer right now, okay? You would think that let's take, for example, Lawrence Angel. He places the delta fragment in the front of the head, and we can actually see it coming out the back. And David O. Davis, who made that illustration where he put down where he thought the fracture pattern was, well, he missed a fracture, and he also was complicit in stating that the delta fragment came from the front of the head. I believe if you look at the primary evidence, gauge eyewitness evidence against that, you can come to a coherent conclusion as to the damage to JFK's skull. And that's my presentation for today. I'm sorry, I could have talked more, but I'm not going to make it through. And I'll let David take it over.
Randy, I have to take a 2-minute bladder break. Why don't you take questions?
Okay, that's great.
I'm going to pass this skull cap around.
Okay.
The question I had is, some people at Parkland Hospital claim that they saw wounds in the back.
Right.
So you're saying that they, based on the rushing of the situation, I guess the time, I don't know how long they had the actual body, but just a quick glance, it wasn't a sufficient analysis.
Correct. What I believe, as I said, and this is what drives people crazy, I believe, is that if you look at Bob Groden here has documented all of the eyewitnesses there. Most of them put their hands back at the top of their head just like this.
Right.
Now, eyewitness testimony. You know, if you look at the x-rays, this is not very far off from what we're seeing on the skull x-rays. And as I said, the delta fragment was retrieved without any scalp attached to it. And if a bullet's coming forwards towards it, it would protect the scalp that's behind it from a bullet from in front. So it left the scalp intact, which gives you that peak. That's the cover-up. You know, you take it here, you pull it here, you cover up the hole. You pull it back down, there's a big hole, which for some people is difficult, but you have to just visualize things and analyze it, as I believe I have correctly, and take those two factors into account. Most of the Parkland eyewitnesses are very close to what the actual bone loss was. Now, if someone puts their hand back here, then they're kind of off. And the other thing is that JFK was lying on his back on the table. They didn't, besides maybe Kemp Clark and Robert Grossman, no one pulled his head up to look at it, you know. So this area would have been pretty much hidden from view from most of the people who were operating under the most extenuating circumstances. Their objective at that point in time was to save JFK's life, not try to figure out which direction a bullet came from or that. And I personally, that's my personal opinion, is you always have to take the primary versus the eyewitnesses. Yes?
Just in follow-up to his question, then, how, Dr. Robertson, how do you explain, what was it?
McClellan, yeah.
Also Carrico and I think another doctor who claimed to have seen macerated
Cerebellum. That is a good question, and that comes down to the primary evidence. Of all the evidence that I have seen, I take most of it at face value. The picture of the brain, there's no way to authenticate that. I mean, with the JFK skull x-rays, we have the dental records. We have they use the pattern of the aeration of the paranasal sinuses to compare pre-mortem skull x-rays versus the post-mortem skull x-rays. Those you can authenticate on that basis. But a picture of a brain sitting on a table, it could be your brain, it could be my brain, it could be Joe Blow's brain who got, you know, shot yesterday. And the bullet does enter low. If you want to believe their eyewitness testimony, then the picture of the brain we have in front of us or presented to us as the real brain should not be JFK's brain. I have no way of resolving that. And that's a possibility that I cannot rule out. However,
aside from the fact that there's a discrepancy between the brain photo and the idea that there's missing cerebellum, how would you explain seeing cerebellum from a hole that is higher than the occipital?
well, that would make me think that most likely, well, but if the bullet went in low, let's just say the first bullet went in low, caused some damage, this is hypothetical, caused some damage to the cerebellum. Then another bullet comes in from the front, displacing the delta fragment, you know, macerating the brain that it's gone through. It's possible that some of the damaged cerebellum could have fallen out, as did other brain matter, onto the gurney in the trauma room 1 at Parkland Hospital.
Through the fire.
Fire, yeah, it's a big hole, and, you know, every time they were compressing his chest, the torn arteries, blood was squirting out of his head with every one of those compressions. And I know that the nurses there said that there was brain and blood tissue all over the gurney. And that's the other thing that you have to also recognize, is that those are extremely extenuating circumstances, and you're not looking to, in retrospect, or saying, well, we have to figure out what this is. Maybe they made a mistake, maybe they didn't. And as I said, if there are a way to absolutely authenticate the picture of the brain, I would say that McClellan and anyone else who says they saw cerebellum was wrong. However, without that verification of whose brain it is, I cannot definitively say that they're right or wrong. And that's my position. Yes, we'll get to everybody.
In this first couple of minutes, I apologize if you already covered this, but in your previous presentations, you had talked about the radial effect.
Oh, Papa's Law, yeah.
Papa's Law, the joint crack. I could never find that on that skull x-ray.
Well, if you're my presentation this afternoon, you'll see it. Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, using your finger, point to where you see an interest on the back?
That's a funny thing, too, because you know what? This is just a little take on this, is that when people go and say, there's stuff missing here, okay, how do they know exactly where their hand's at? Unless you're looking in a mirror, I can't tell you whether it's up here, what's up here. The entry hole, I can feel the EOP on the back of my head right about here, and I believe the entry hole is up and to the right, somewhere around here, and that the point is right at the cowlick, basically, where the second bullet hit from the front. That is, it's difficult to say. And the back of the head photograph that you saw there is absolutely worthless to try to determine where that bullet went in, okay? There's some brain tissue on the surface, but who knows? The proper method would have been to shave the scalp, which they did not do, and in light of that, who knows? And that's why the x-rays are so important, because it really doesn't matter where the hole in the scalp is, because the bullet would either have to make a hole and or fractures as it went through the skull, because that's the only way it can go from the scalp to the skull to get to the brain. That's,
Is that true for the front? Do you think there could have been a frontal shot?
oh, there was a frontal shot, yeah. And it went through the first hole made by the, when the Harper whites, the 4 fragments get blown out the front. The second one comes from the grassy knoll, enters that hole, slams into the back of the head, ejects the delta fragment, which had been intact until that point, otherwise it would have been blown off by the initial explosion. So that's my point.
Your contention is they were simultaneous.
Well, nearly simultaneous. There's about a tenth of a second. And I can explain that with the acoustics, but
Next presentation.
yeah. Well, I may not address it I may not have time to address that particular point, but when you look at the, I don't want to take up David's time here. I'm going to take this last question, but if you look at the timing, both gunmen, one from the Daltex and one from the grassy knoll, I assume it had to be radio coordinated. But if 2 people are tracking JFK and you say shoot, and 2 people pull the trigger as fast as they can, they only have to pull it within a quarter of a second of each other, okay? Which I think is quite doable, okay? Because it might take them half a second to react. One guy might take 3/8, but they would still be within that quarter second to cause the simultaneous boom boom of 2 shots hitting within roughly 2 Zapruder frames. So with that, I will step down and let David take over.